Let's go ahead and get started today. Hope everybody's doing well. We're going to wrap up the material for the semester today. So we got behind on these last few chapters, so I kind of cut down what you need to worry about in chapter 8 to just a few things, mostly the social contract stuff. So it's going to be basically three main thinkers and their ideas. We've got Hobbes versus Locke on social contract theory, and then we'll look briefly at a contemporary contractarian, John Rawls, his idea of justice as fairness. All those are contract theorists, they're just different varietals of contract theorists. So, Nicholas, one thing to worry about for you, since we studied social contract theory in the other class as well, there we looked at Hobbes' theory as a moral theory, where the idea is that moral norms derive their the correct moral norms derive their force, their normative force, and their content from the agreement made between self-interested rational agents, right? Here, social contract theory is going to be a theory of political authority. So what distinguishes, according to each of these theories, particularly Hobbes and Locke, a legitimate versus an illegitimate political authority? When would revolution or civil disobedience be justified? That's also covered in the chapter, and I'll mention a little bit, but we won't go that in depth into that portion of the chapter. Just worry about social contract. So we'll have Hobbes on one side and Locke on the other. Social contract theories all have some particular parts to them. The state of nature, then how they understand the contract, or sometimes they say compact, and then political authority. So, the state of nature. What do these political philosophy often starts off like this in Western philosophy? What would the ideal state or society be like? And then, what would we have to do, us measly humans, to get there, to realize that ideal political organization? So the way some of these theories start off is by imagining what the human condition would be like prior to the formation of any kind of society. All right, so that's the state of nature, right? What society is like. No, I'm sorry, excuse me. What the human condition is like prior to the formation of any kind of society or commonwealth. And so the idea here is that society is understood as a contract, right? So given what the state of nature is like, we would have certain reasons for entering into or maybe not entering into a social contract with others, and then that will also shape what view of legitimate political authority or what justifies a political authority. Right, so they're kind of all three connected here. So let's take a look at some passages out of Hobbes and Locke here to fill that out a little bit. And then, of course, given what political authority is legitimate, we can start to worry about, okay, well, when can you resist or work against political authority? Right? What would justify civil disobedience? What, if anything, would justify civil disobedience or maybe revolution? Hobbes and Locke are pretty much kind of the two founding fathers of modern social contract theory because they give us two basic modern but very different political philosophies. One of them is basically the father of modern democratic thought, or one of the fathers of modern democratic thought, and one of them is authoritarian. So lots of movies with this stuff. We could wonder whether Cartman is a justified policeman or not, a political authority or not, or whether he's just dressing up like one. In the movie Ants, you have this whole thing about the relationship between the individual and society. The ants live in a collective where your identity is shaped by your role in the whole, and Zeke wants to charge his own way. He doesn't want to just be either a worker or a warrior. He wants to choose his own way. And then, of course, V for Vendetta. I'll put the trailer up for this if you haven't seen it. You've got a fairly Hobbesian view of society depicted in that show through the government of that show, who depict V as a terrorist. So social contract theory, again, we've got three basic elements here, but the basic idea is simply the view that governmental authority, right, justified or legitimate governmental authority, depends on an agreement to empower it, right? And then what motivates that agreement, and the shape of that agreement will depend on the particular theory itself. But this is the basic idea then of social contract theory, is that governmental authority depends on what it is empowered to do. So we got, again, those three elements. I'm going to skip the Plato part of the chapter, but Plato's ideal city consisted in three classes and three types of individuals, and so you were told basically where to go, and then governed by reason, of course, as the philosophers always like to have it that way. So a well-ordered soul is a soul in which courage and spirited and desire are governed by reason, and a well-ordered society is one in which the craftsmen and the guardians are governed by reason as well. And so justice for Plato, just real quickly, is each type playing their particular role. Of course, those roles, even in Plato's ideal society, get assigned to you. Then we get to modern social contract theory. So again, Hobbes and Locke here. Hobbes is going to have a fairly pessimistic view of the state of nature. Locke is going to have a more optimistic view. In Hobbes' view, there's no such thing as morality in the state of nature. He's got a famous line about it. But in Locke, even in the state of nature, we have inalienable rights. So if you're starting off with the idea of inalienable moral rights within the state of nature, there's already going to be a basis for for distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate government action on you. We are still going to enter into the social contract out of self-preservation. The contract makes it easier for us to preserve ourselves. In Locke's view, you get some independent judges and things like that as well. Political authority is different. In Hobbes, he has this idea of the sovereign, which is basically an authoritarian ruler. The sovereign's will is the basis of justice. So it's literally dictating. What dictators do is they dictate what justice is, right? And then in Locke's view, there's popular sovereignty. So it's the will of the people. He used that language that justifies, that empowers the political authority. In Hobbes's view, what empowers the sovereign is simply their ability to maintain order. So it's like law and order and nothing else, right, is what matters for the Hobbesian version. So here's a picture of Hobbes. In the backdrop of Hobbes's political philosophy during his own times, he witnessed the English Civil War, and this really influenced his political philosophy. It's hard to think of Hobbes's political philosophy accurately without situating it historically. And so he saw his country decay into what he considered chaos, and so he basically sets it up with what might look like kind of a false dichotomy between two extremes of either chaos and freedom or order and peace. Right? And he thinks that rational, self-interested people prefer peace as opposed to chaos. Right? So that's what's going to generate the social contract there. So in the state of nature, he says, so that the nature of man, we find three principal causes of quarrel: competition, diffidence, and glory. So seeking, I don't know, what would it be for us? Glory, like, I don't know, social media fame or something like that. Competition's easy, you get that business as well as sports and, in professional life. And then diffidence, in other words, indifference towards, mistrust towards each other. And so in the state of nature, that's all there is that quarrel. He says, in the state of nature, there's no account of time. No arts, no letters, no society, right? So there's no media, there's no printed word, there's no artworks, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, here's the famous line: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Sometimes people say it short, nasty, brutish, and nasty, or something like that. But that's the actual quote from. So it's lonely, you're impoverished, and it's hard, and you're going to die young. Right. So there's the pessimistic aspect of the state of nature. So the other phrase that he uses is that it's a war of everyone against everyone. So why might you want to enter into society if that's the condition you're in? Well, it's going to be peaceful. So in the state of nature, there are still natural laws, but the primary natural law and the first natural law is self-preservation. So I can do whatever I think is necessary to preserve myself. There are no moral limits on that in the state of nature. For Hobbes, morality doesn't exist except as a human invention, so he's an anti-realist in that regard. And so you only have morality once we start to have agreements between people. You only have a society, right? So first, notice we are first and foremost individuals, right? And then second, we're members of society in Hobbes' view. That's true of Locke as well. People like Aristotle would have rejected that. We're social animals. Locke, we're still gregarious, but we're still individuals by nature first. So each of them kind of have that notion of the modern individual working here as well. So he says, again, all we have is our own judgments and reason, and he shall conceive to be the aptest means to do so. So the only thing that matters is, which means can I pursue to most effectively and efficiently preserve myself? If that means taking my neighbor's stuff, that means taking my neighbor's stuff at gunpoint. Oops. What happened? So let's see where to drop it. Is that the last one? Yeah. So because the condition of man is a war of everyone against everyone, in which case everyone is governed by his own reason, so there's no public reason, which is usually considered a cornerstone of democratic free societies, where people come together to collectively deliberate. And there is nothing he can make use of that shall not be helped unto him in preserving his life against his enemies. It followeth that in such a condition every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body. So there's no limits. Bodily autonomy, rights of bodily autonomy are not a thing in the state of nature according to Hobbes. So, and therefore, as long as this nature of right to every man to everything. So again, self-preservation and what you think you need to do in what you think is necessary to preserve your own life, that's totally fine in the state of nature. And therefore, as long as this natural right of every man to everything endureth, there can be no security to any man, right? So if that's the situation we live in, then you're going to be in constant fear. Anytime you accumulate any resources, it's The Walking Dead here. You're going to be in threat of someone coming and taking your stuff, right? So zombie movies are kind of a great fictional thing here, because what happens is there's a catastrophe, civil society goes away, you're left on your own, and you have to figure out who you can trust and who you can't trust, who you can make agreements with and who you can't make agreements with. So we enter into a contract out of our self-interested rationality. The state of nature is horribly violent, continual fear, but I'm operating in my own rational self-interest. So Hobbes's idea here is that if you're interested in preserving your own life, that you will make agreements with others about how you're going to treat each other, and there we have the basis of society. So if I have a lot of resources, you come and instead of worrying about me retaliating against you for taking my stuff, you come and offer me some chickens for my grain. So we end up with some kind of exchange there. So he says, the first branch of which rule containeth the first and fundamental law of nature, which is to seek peace and follow it. And the second, the sum of the right of nature, which is by all means we can to defend ourselves. So the best way to defend yourself is to really seek peace. Right? So then the contract becomes a mutual transferring of those natural rights for political rights, and that's called the contract. That's the contract according to Hobbes. So in order to preserve ourselves, it doesn't take long to recognize that in a world of chaos, it's harder to preserve yourself than a world in which you've made agreements with other people out of our own self-interest. So that is the idea, that it is in everybody's rational self-interest to seek peace and preserve their own lives. They'll make these agreements. So justice only comes about once we get that contract. Only once there's a contract can we understand what's fair and what's unfair. So justice is the constant will of giving to every man his own. And therefore, where there is no own, like in the state of nature, there is no propriety, there is no injustice. And where there is no coercive power erected, that means government, that is, where there is no commonwealth, nothing is unjust. So that the nature of justice consisted in the keeping of valid contracts, but the validity of covenants begins not with the constitution of a civil power sufficient to compel men to keep them, and then it is also that propriety begins. So justice is only arrives on the scene once we have a contract and a civil authority that can enforce that contract. So then on authority, when the representative is one man or more, and if more, then it is assembly of all, or but of a part. When the representative is one man, then the commonwealth is a monarchy. And when an assembly of all that will come together, then it is a democracy or a popular commonwealth. Other kinds of commonwealth there can be none, for either one or more or all must have a sovereign power, indivisible, entire. So regardless of which kind, you still need a sovereign power to enforce those contracts. So then the best type of government, according to Hobbes, the difference between these three kinds of commonwealth consists not in the difference of power, but in the difference of convenience or aptitude to produce peace and security of people, for which end they were instituted. Right? So the formation of government, the reason why government comes about, according to Hobbes, is to provide order and peace. All right. So it's going to turn out then that the only justifiable reason you could have for going against the established authority is when they fail to provide peace and authority and order. Right. That's about the only place where legitimate civil disobedience or revolution could be, according to Hobbes, because otherwise the sovereign can use whatever means they want to maintain that peace and order, even if it's ruling through fear and lies and propaganda. So from whence it follows that where the public and private interest are most closely united, there is the public most advanced,
Now in monarchy, the private interest is the same as the public. The riches, power, and honor of the monarch arise only from the riches, strength, and reputation of his subjects. For no king can be rich, nor glorious, nor secure, whose subjects are either poor or contemptible, or too weak through want or dissension to maintain a war against their enemies. Whereas in a democracy or aristocracy, the public prosperity confers not so much on the private fortune of one that is corrupt or ambitious, as doth many times a perfidious advice, a treacherous action, or a civil war. So it's not wisdom, like in Plato, that justifies government, because they understand how the whole and the parts are comprised of it and the relationship between the two. It's authority that makes law, because they're able to maintain order. So it's, what justifies Negan in The Walking Dead? It's his ability to maintain that order in that little enclave. So political obligation, what obligations do we have to either the authority or to other citizens? The obligation of the subjects to the sovereign is understood to last as long and no longer than the power lasteth by which he is able to protect them. So when the sovereign, and with Hobbes we need to use like capital S sovereign because it plays such an important role and kind of has near tyrannical authority. That's the aim of government, and so when the government fails to achieve that aim, that's the only place where you can begin to question or go against the authority and return to the state of nature. So Hobbes' basic argument here is if individuals are predominantly motivated by self-interest to preserve their own lives, then individuals will agree to live according to life-preserving peacekeeping rules. Right? Individuals are predominantly motivated by self-interest to preserve their own lives. That's the psychological egoism thesis. Thus, individuals will agree to live according to life-preserving and peacekeeping rules. So it's out of our own desire to preserve our own lives that we see that is most efficiently and most well done by making agreements with others. It's easier for me to do the things that I want and bring my life joy if I don't have to worry about somebody coming stealing my Xbox, right? Because there's no authority to keep them from doing that. So that's Hobbes' basic argument there. Another way of trying to justify social contract theory is with the prisoner's dilemma. And it's about coordinating activity with someone else that you can't talk to. The only thing you can presuppose about them is that they are self-interested and rational as well. And would they make the decision to cooperate or defect with you to get the least amount of time? And as it turns out, there's enough people that always defect that it wouldn't work out, just empirically. So then we get Locke, right? Again, Hobbes' fairly pessimistic view of the state of nature, short, nasty, brutish. We're all self-interested egos, but we want peace, so we enter into and make agreements with other people to found a society and erect a sovereign to enforce that contract to keep the peace. We're only justified in going against the sovereign when the sovereign fails to efficiently keep peace and order. But they could do just about anything they want in order to maintain that stuff. So again, if you've seen V for Vendetta, they're like collecting data on the attitudes of the populace and then using that to manipulate them through the media, right? So again, fairly Hobbesian idea there. Basically absolute political authority for the aim of order. Notice, protecting liberty is not in Hobbes's, at the forefront of Hobbes's political philosophy. It's about order, right? So you're only going to get as much freedom as you're going to be able to get when it doesn't disrupt order, and of course, freedom disrupts order. So then we get Locke. Locke's a democratic political theorist. Right? Although it still has problems because if you lived under minority, if you were in a demographic minority and everybody voted that all the blonde people get more rights, that would be justified in Locke's view because he doesn't have minority rights protections in it, at least yet. That's a later development in political philosophy, but he at least lays out the basic idea of popular sovereignty that influenced America's own founders, in fact. So he's a British empiricist philosopher. Here's what he says about the state of nature. So again, contrast this with Locke. The state of nature has the law of nature to govern it. So they both have laws of nature. which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law. So reason is the law of nature here, not self-preservation. Teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So that's already in the state of nature. That's a major contrast with Hobbes then. We already have, treating people equally, morally, that you shouldn't harm people unnecessarily, or disrupt or take anything that disrupts or that harms their life, health, or their liberty or their possessions. So we even already have personal possessions a kind of personal property or private property, although Marx would have used that phrase differently than Locke here, in the state of nature. For men, being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker. This is why we have rights and morality in the state of nature, is because we're creations of God, for Locke. All the servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are, made to last during his, not one another's, pleasure. And being furnished with like faculties, sharing all in one community of nature, there cannot be supposed to be any such subordination among us. So we already have moral equality written into the state of nature in Locke's view. That one may authorize us to destroy one another, as if we were made for one another's uses, as if inferior ranks of creatures are ours. So we already have this idea that rational beings are intrinsically valuable, like we have in Kant and came later. We have that in Locke as well. Everyone, as he is bound to preserve himself and not to quit his station willfully, so by like reason, when his own preservation comes not in competition, he ought, as much as he can, to preserve the rest of mankind, and may not, unless it be to do justice on an offender, take away or impair the life of what tends to be the preservation of life, liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. Right, so we've already got a very different view of the state of nature. That's going to restrict then what our political authority, even a legitimate one, can do much more than in Hobbes's scheme. So he says, in Hobbes, the end of government is order and peace. Right? That's why the government is established. That's why we enter in the contract. And when they fail to do that, that's the only little thing that could justify revolt or returning to the state of nature. Well, what's the end of government according to Locke, since he doesn't think that everything is so nasty in the state of nature? So he says, the great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into a commonwealth and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property, to which the state of nature there are many things wanting. First, there wants an established, settled, known law. So one of the benefits we get by entering into a commonwealth is that we get an independent judiciary with the law that's written down so everybody knows what's up. Right? Received and allowed by common consent to be the standard of right and wrong. And the common measure to decide all controversies between them. So we get not only legislation, but we get a judiciary that's independent. For though the law of nature be plain and intelligible to all rational creatures, yet men being biased by their own interests, as well as ignorant of want for study of it, are not apt to follow it as a law binding to them in the application of it to their particular cases. Right? So we need an independent judiciary to act against the bad actors, right? But in the Hobbes's view, it's like everybody's a bad actor because they're all self-interested and out to cut each other's throats. But that's not the case in Locke's state of nature. So it's a hypothetical condition. We're imagining what we think it would be like without government, and then developing our political philosophy from there. So going on here. But then men, when they enter into a society, give up the equality, liberty, and executive power they have in the state of nature into the hands of society, to be so far disposed by the legislative, as the good in the society shall require, yet it being only with the intention in every one the better to preserve himself, his liberty, and property. For no rational creature can be supposed to change his condition with the intention to be worse. the power of the society or legislative constituted by them, right? Not by their capacity to maintain order, but by popular sovereignty, right? Can never be supposed to extend farther than the common good. And the common good here is the protection of property, including the property of their own life. So, I mean, that's the thing in Locke, is that you own yourself, like you own external property for Locke. It's the basis of self-ownership. That's why lots of libertarians draw on Locke's philosophy here. So, and so whoever has the legislative or supreme power in any commonwealth is bound to govern by established standing laws promulgated and known to the people, and not by extemporaneous decrees, like the way the sovereign does. By indifferent or upright judges who are to decide the controversies by those laws, not simply what would keep the peace, which might be violating a law sometimes, and to employ the force of the community at home only to the execution of such laws or abroad to prevent redress from foreign injuries and secure the community from inroads and invasion. And all this is to be directed to no other end but the peace, safety, and public good of the people, which again is rooted in the protection of property for Locke. So tyranny, the unjustifiable government, is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have the right to do. And this is making use of power anyone has in his hands, not for the good of those who are under it, but for his own private separate advantage. So if the executive branch starts doing things for their own self-interest rather than the interest of the people that are being governed, like their private interests, their own financial gain, for example, we're justified in overthrowing them according to law. So when the governor, however entitled, makes not the law, but his will the rule, and his commands and actions are not directed to the preservation of the properties of his people, but the satisfaction of his own ambition, revenge, covetousness, or any other irregular passion. So you can vote them out in Locke's view. So then when would we be justified in civil disobedience or revolution? Civil disobedience, there's one or a few laws that are morally deficient in some way. Revolution, the whole system's got to go, right? The whole thing is corrupt to the point that it can't be reformed. It has to be overthrown. Right? So whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who were thereupon absolved from any further obedience. So that we no longer have a political obligation to obey the law at that point. So we're absolved from any further obedience and are left to the common refuge which God has provided for all men against force and violence. So if the government starts doing things again to enrich the ruling class rather than the common good, we're justified in, and they make themselves the arbiters rather than the laws the arbiters of disputes, then we're justified in revolution. So whensoever, therefore, the legislative shall transgress this fundamental rule of society, and either by ambition, fear, folly, or corruption endeavor to grasp for themselves or to put into the hands of any other an absolute power over the lives, liberties, and estates of people, by which this breach of trust for the forfeit, the power and the people had put into their hands for quite contrary ends, and it dissolves the people who have a right to resume their own original liberty so they can go back into the state of nature by the establishment of a new legislative which they think fit, provide for their own safety and security, which is the end for which they are in society. So if under our system, if authorities started using like eminent domain laws to take people's property, not for the public good, but because they were going to give it over to private development that they were invested in or something like that, that'd be reason for dispute with that authority, right, on Locke's score here. So we end up, again, with contrasting social contract theories. On Hobbes's view, it's a war of all against all. We enter into that social contract because we want peace and are so worried about fear and violent death that we're giving up basically all of our liberties to a sovereign just because they can maintain order. The only reason for rejecting that political authority is if they fail to maintain peace and order. Otherwise, they pretty much have absolute rule over us and can do all sorts of stuff to, lying, persecuting minorities or demographic minorities or something like that to maintain order. So justice is just the sovereign's will, then, whatever the sovereign dictates. And then in Locke, again, we already have morality, we have inalienable rights. Again, that's Locke's phrase there, even in the state of nature. So that's going to limit what other people and what the government can do to individuals. We enter into the social contract for the preservation of our own private property. That is empowered not by the political authority's main capacity to maintain order, but because of popular sovereignty. It's we invest that legislative branch through voting, right, to write laws that are in favor of the majority rule. That's the problem, is that majority rule can be just as tyrannical as one person in some cases. So again, that's where Locke needs supplementation. In the book, they talk about how you could do that with Martin Luther King and protection of minority rights there. And then justice is going to be a matter of that popular sovereignty and popularly justified laws, again, majority rule laws, that empower the government to enforce them based on, again, like things like, again, the language in our Constitution, like the will of the people rather than the will of an individual. And so for Locke, you can have either particular laws that need correcting, and so you might be engaged in violating that particular law, or doing something to raise awareness about a particular law to reform it. If it violated the reason for which we entered into the contract, again, protection of private property, or if things get so bad that the whole system is corrupt and they're, the ruling classes, the legislative branches, operating in their own self-interest rather than the interest of everybody, we can overthrow them, right, and return to the state of nature. So again, different things justify different political authority in each of those cases, and each one has a different justification for when it's okay to go against the established authority. All right, questions about Hobbes or Locke? He's good on that. And then, so one way of thinking about justice is the sovereign's will. Another way of thinking about popular sovereignty and justified by that. Well, another more contemporary way of trying to develop social contract arguments and social contract theory is John Rawls. He, instead of the state of nature, he imagines an original position, or what he calls the original position. So it's a little bit of a thought experiment, and it's in this original position that we are to select the principles of justice that organize all of society's fundamental institutions. And so it's a way of trying to think about how we would choose together the principles that organize society, but we need to have some mechanism for choosing together in respectable ways. So Rawls is a Kantian, so all rational agents have intrinsic value, so we're trying to take into account the fact that we're rational agents, but to minimize or omit things that would cause us to bias our conception of justice that we're going to use to organize all of society. So this is his trick for trying to do that with this thought experiment. He says, thus we are to imagine that those who engage in social cooperation choose together in one joint act the principles which are to assign basic rights and duties to determine the division of social benefits. The original position is understood as a purely hypothetical situation characterized so as to lead to a certain conception of justice. Among the essential features of this situation is that no one knows his place in society, has his, his class position or social status. So you don't know whether you're rich or poor, whether you're a professional or a day laborer or unemployed. You don't know what race you are. You don't know your sexual orientation. You don't know what gender you are. You don't know what political party you are. You don't know what religious community you're a member of, or if you're a member of any at all. So nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. So you don't know whether you're an athlete or not, whether you're a genius or just of average intelligence. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good or their special psychological propensities. Are you patient or impatient, this sort of thing? Quick to anger. So the idea here is that behind this veil of ignorance, you're just reasoning as a rational agent, qua rational agent, in and of, without all the other stuff that informs many of your daily decisions. Right? So the principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance, a veil in which we don't know any of these things. This ensures that no one is advantaged or disadvantaged in the choice of principles by the outcome of natural chance or the contingency of social circumstances. Since all are similarly situated and no one is able to assign principles to his particular favor or his particular condition, the principles of justice are the result of a fair agreement or bargain. And then Rawls thinks, as he points out here, what conception of justice would everyone choose behind this veil of ignorance? Well, we've looked at a couple of different conceptions of justice so far. I'll list out some more. So one would be to each as, these are slogans, is chosen, actually it's from the choice, the libertarian view. The choices you make dictate what you are and are not awarded to be. Two, we could have a utilitarian view, maximize overall happiness. This is going to be like a liberal egalitarian view. Rawls's view is called justice as fairness, which you read a little bit about today. Another view might be merit. So that would be like an Aristotelian view. It's proportionality. So you just think to yourself, what conception of justice would you choose? Would you choose, I left one off here. Would you choose Hobbes' sovereign? Basically an authoritarian rule. Well, Rawls argues that behind this original position, we would pick this Kantian. It's a Kantian-inspired version of a theory of justice, but it's worth pointing out that Kant has inspired both liberal egalitarian views, like Rawls's view, as well as libertarian views, like somebody like Robert Nozick, who was at Harvard at the same time as Rawls, and they had a big debate. Much of the agenda for contemporary political philosophy was like kind of set by these 4 or 5 guys at Harvard back in the middle of the 20th century. So here's his notion of justice as fairness. It's got 2 basic principles, but one of them has 2 parts. So depending on who you're reading, they might say 3. But I do it in terms of 2. So this is justice as fairness. First, we get an extensive scheme, actually, of liberties. But they're equal liberties. If you have a right to do or not do something, then everybody else has the same right to do or not do that thing. So, for example, get a right to choose which religion, if any, that you wish to practice, right? So, or free speech, right? Each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of basic liberties compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. So that's a pretty extensive set of liberties, right? The only limit on it would be where it's not possible for us to have equal liberties. So then we get so that's the liberty principle. Then we get the difference principle. This really has kind of 2 elements to it as well. There's the difference principle and then the equality principle that's in it as well. So that's A, is the equality principle. So social and economic inequalities are to be arranged that A, they are to be the benefit, that be of the greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society. So inequalities are, it's not that we're not going to have any inequalities in society, but we should always structure them, or do our best to structure all of them so that those inequalities are to the most benefit to the least well-off in society. So that's where a bunch of debate arises over Rawls's principle, is A here, that difference principle, because that would require some redistribution, right, of wealth. So for example, TOPS takes money out of my paycheck and funds tuition with it, right? We get taxed so that we can have roads. Should we get taxed so that we can have museums, or should that be entirely privately funded? I'm old enough to remember that when billionaires wanted a pet project, they just created a museum instead of overtaking a social media platform. So maybe we shouldn't have publicly funded some stuff. I mean, that's what a public education does, that, right? That's right. That's what, you know, there's a redistributive measure there. The question is, you know, the idea here being that you have a better society, a better free society when you have an educated public to deliberate over things as when you don't, right? And then B, here's our equality principle. Offices and positions must be open to everyone under conditions of fair and equal opportunity. So you get to run for office regardless of who your parents are, right? It's not like a bloodline issue or something like this. So there's a principle of equality there as well. So that's Rawls's notion of justice as fairness. Again, most of the debate over that is over A here, in what's the extent of that distribution would be required in order to arrange things so that they are to the most benefit to the least well off. And how much bureaucracy do you need to ensure that it does it correctly, and all those sorts of things come out there. So again, that's justice as fairness.